The Actual Play podcast is a genre that is growing rapidly, but how can we help promote its growth into an enjoyable form of theater? This week, join me, Zach Walsh, as I talk to Nathan about his new free-to-play role-playing game, Domains of Shadows. We discuss Shakespeare, Gothic horror, and role-playing as an art form. Welcome to Scheduled for Launch, a podcast to discover projects you may not have heard of. This week, I am very excited and happy to be joined by Nathan. We're going to be discussing his new system and game, Domains of Shadows. Nathan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Zach.
This is a really cool project. I haven't really seen anything that's designed to be like this, so I'm really interested to kind of pick your brain a little bit about what is going to be included in Domains of Shadows.
Yes, this has been in progress for, I've been told an unusual amount for a project this size has been in progress since the winter of 2018, so I have a lot of thoughts gathered and many different things I could state. I did some pretty extensive research before I started creating this, so I should have a lot of different bits of conversation to give to you.
I'm happy to hear it. But before we really dive into Domains of Shadows, Nathan, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
I am Nathan Cavalier, a blossoming indie role-playing system designer. Currently, right now, I'm choosing my company's brand as Wheel of the Weird Role-Playing. It's nothing official yet. But as I'm hoping to create more games, I'm hoping that will attract more attention than just my standard name. My mission is to design systems that recognize the potential of role-playing to not just be an experience of entertainment, but a form of art that can be used to question the human condition and cultivate a growthful mindset. It's something that I saw is kind of an untapped potential in a lot of role-playing systems is to actually create it for outside audience or be used as closer to an art form. I was heavily inspired by the works of Avery Alder, creator of Dream Apart, Jason Morningstar, creator of Fiasco, and Stephen Dewey, the creator of 10 Candles, as well as other revolutionary designers in the role-playing world. They created a lot of the conventions behind the traditions of GM-less systems, story games, and although I don't really prescribe to GNS theory, narrativist role-playing is a pretty good goal for what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And another thing that should be noted is that all the products that are going to be published through Weird of the Wheel will be freely available to all. I don't plan on ever charging for any of the system I make now or in the future.
That's a really cool goal there, just to have something that's there for people to discover and see for themselves. So, what is Domains of Shadow?
How descriptive do you want me to be?
As descriptive as you'd like.
Okay, then I'll give some basic. Domains of Shadow is a GM-less story game of Gothic horror and Shakespearean tragedy. It is especially designed to tell stories that would be presented as actual play performances, and are meant to be just as enjoyable to an outside audience as the people actually playing this. Almost all of the mechanics in the system were built around what this can be best done to most facilitate an audio play format to maintain to basically push as much as possible to in-character action and to showing rather than telling, to create an actual a more theatrical method, meant to kind of smooth pacing, to create drama, and have some streamlined rules that seldom ever come up, so that you can tell it as something closer to improv or standard radio play.
That's actually really cool. There are some really great GM-less systems out there that are seeming to kind of not push towards better actual play podcast styles, but they are sometimes easier for listeners of those styles of entertainment to fall into. How does Domain of Shadows set itself up to be used as an actual play style?
So the main thing that I was thinking of is, when studying actual plays, one thing I observed was the main thing that probably kept, people from doing the entertainment is let's talk about length of how many these actual plays are. Usually a session is like 3 hours. To tell a full story can oftentimes take several campaigns. This is very inaccessible to the audience if they need to watch 24 hours of content to play a whole story. What Domains of Shadow does is it was inspired heavily by Fiasco as well as some other GM-less role-playing in a way that condensed it down so the story can be told in an hour. And not, well, an hour is pretty short, but 2 hours or 3 hours rather than the standard campaign play.
Yeah.
The main way it does that is rather than telling the story continuously in one stream where it's just kind of where it's kind of negotiated between GM and players and you move on whatever pace necessary. What's going on with Domains of Shadow is there are multiple distinct scenes which aren't necessarily continuous in time. You only play out the dramatically important things or the ones that people want to, so once a scene ends, if there's any kind of like planning periods or any just logistical things that would need to be talked about, purchasing of equipment or any of those other tasks related to planning, then those would occur off screen, and then you would move on to onto a next scene. It's basically said that any details in the story which aren't relevant to cover or wouldn't be important for the audience, you can skip over, and you can focus on always, those more impactful and or climatic scenes. That was heavily inspired by Fiasco, which, if you've ever seen actual play or seen a session, you can see that in play.
And those are some of the most popular games right now. I'm finding a lot of people are kind of coming along and seeing those games and they're wanting to play it. So if I understand right, the idea of having the GM-less system is more so to streamline the conversation and kind of avoid the rules as talk, but keep the story going.
Yes, the GM-less. The major reason why I was doing this GM-less is because when you have a GM, your players can't just do things. They have to get it past the GM for approval. Now, sometimes that can be quick and it's not necessarily a problem, but on actual plays, you look through a conversation and sometimes they'll have to spend some time negotiating. The player has to negotiate between the GM between what is acceptable and what they should know, which can kind of make it hard for an audience to feel immersed in it, and sometimes even the players. What GM-less systems do is that you don't need to go through that extra level of processing. You can invent details into the storyline that would facilitate or make it go quicker. If you're not, this, I mean, even came up in the first, in some of the playtests, it's kind of like the details. If you don't know, if you don't say know how many lifeboats your ship has when a crash occurs, normally you would have to ask the GM that kind of detail, and they would need to kind of make a guess, and you would have an argument. With a GM system like this, you can just state how many would be reasonable or dramatic for the scene. It doesn't require that extra level of processing, so that it can be done in action and in character, rather than expressed out of character, which is meant to increase immersion in the story and allow the audience to not see those like designer's notes during the play.
Okay, I kind of get that. That's really cool. One of the things I really like about Domain of Shadows here is also that it runs on non-continuous stories for the most part. From what I understand, you sent me a little bit of the playtest in the first draft, and as you said, you can hear a story over the course of 24 hours via podcast. But Domains of Shadows aims to cut that down into smaller chunks. Almost the best thing I can compare it to in modern TV, I guess, would be Black Mirror. So it's these bite-sized stories instead of huge sprawling campaigns. Is that a good way to describe Domain of Shadows?
That was actually exactly what I was thinking of. In fact, I was actually thinking of creating an actual play podcast based off of this, and I was already thinking of doing that kind of a Twilight Zone or Black Mirror structure where you have a new story every single time it's being told with different characters, a self-contained story.
Okay, yeah, I really like that. And you mentioned characters there. Something super cool to me is actually how you've described characters in Domains of Shadows as not necessarily needing to be one main person, but a maybe even like a small faction. Could you kind of go into details about kind of setup and characters and how people can hop into this game right from the get go?
So, like all standard role-playing games, during this you each during this you players or the actors are obviously responsible for telling through the characters. Each player will have basically the characters in the story are split into what are called main characters and supporting characters. Every actor will have one main character that they are playing, and these are the ones that are central to the story and have more rules reference to them. Then there will be supporting characters, which are everyone else who are improvised the story is told. The main difference is that the main characters actually have certain text write-ups or things for development. I can't quite get into that now, but basically, main characters are the thing for changing, whereas supporting characters are assumed to be static. And that's typically how it's organized organized with that. But now back to kind of what you were mentioning is that so a main character in this case, or even a supporting character, isn't necessarily a conventional character. It is mentioned that sometimes these can be factions, and that whenever a scene begins, whoever is playing that faction will determine, who is in that scene or just kind of what groups or members of that. Some, examples are like the servants of the castle, the soldiers in an army, or the crew of the crew of a ship. These are based in Shakespearean stage direction so that instead of, representing a single person, you can also choose to represent a group. Although this is also come up less frequently, sometimes even things which aren't really thinking people in the conventional sense can be characters, such as an especially important location that changed a lot can even be a character. A haunted house, or an especially tense environment, or I think one of the playtests we even had the boat as the ship that the characters were on as a character. It's basically anything that has a chance for change over the story, and due to its Gothic and Shakespearean trappings, usually that change is of corruption. Anything which can be developed in corruption over the story is given a role as a character.
And the corruption within Domains of Shadows actually seems to play a really large note of it, especially when you're going through. You mentioned this is a tragedy kind of style, set up with Shakespearean. I noticed that you said fiasco, a little bit of Lovecraftian Call of Cthulhu stuff going on. And the thing that you've named this is the other world, and specifically the blight. How do those factor into telling a progressive gothic horror story?
There aren't many mechanics in Domains of Shadow aside from the things about framing scenes, which I mean I could get into those, but those are pretty simple. The other main mechanic is the blight. And the main thing here is that well, an expert improver could probably represent how a character changes over time well. None of us are really expert improvers, and what the blight is supposed to do is supposed to give guidance into the reflection of your character, kind of falling prey to these tragic flaws or traits that would hinder them. Usually this comes from a place called the Other World, and very little is known about this, but what it is known is that some energies will seep from that other world, and it will cause people to act in ways that bring kind of their destruction. Anytime a main character, would interact with the blight or feel especially strong emotions, they would increase a certain value in one of their traits, because each character is defined by a set of one-word traits. It would add, replace, or remove a trait to reflect the growing influence of the blight. There are a few different types for this. And if it gets high enough, then that character can suffer from a tragic downfall, which is pretty self-explanatory what's happening there. So there is actually a way to... So the tragedy isn't just a setting element, there are actually mechanics to represent the gradual collapse into the development of the traits that continue to make it worse, and then the eventual downfall as a result of it.
And there are different domains that lead into the themes for each of the blights, correct?
Yes, there are multiple types of the blights. Although this system, if you couldn't tell already, was modeled off of Call of Cthulhu's Sanity system, it is different in it in a number of key ways, namely that there are different kind of values for the different types of blights that the character can be affected by. There's 4 of them, and each of them are related to a different kind of emotion or set of themes. The first of the 4, the Blight of Shadow, is associated with betrayal, conspiracy, dread, fear, and paranoia. And as a character becomes infected with this blight, they become gradually more convinced that everyone and everything is acting against them, and that they need to take desperate actions to protect themselves at all costs. The reason why this leads to a tragic downfall is because it causes the person to lose sight of what the actual real threats are, to distance themselves from friends or allies, and to never take proper consideration of what is actually bringing them, because they're too busy jumping at their own shadow or threats which just aren't feasible. Usually those kind of events are triggered whenever a character reveals something that would make them lose their trust, as is suffering a betrayal, uncovering signs of a conspiracy against them or someone they care about, or understanding that a monster can shapeshift or use illusions and the like. The second form of the blight is the Blight of Rot. This one is associated with apathy, callousness, decay, disease, disgust, and pollution. What happens here is that when a character is affected by the Blight of Rot, they'll begin to grow careless, and they'll begin to kind of stop ignoring they'll start ignoring the things that they shouldn't, and growing apathetic and careless. It's basically what is attractive, and why these people often turn to this is because it can kind of seem like, because you're ignoring the pain, like some kind of strength. But what it's actually doing is ignoring the things that are actually causing the problems in the first place. And that's often related to the tragic downfall, is person under the Blight of Rot isn't necessarily aware of what will bring them to get, arrested, physically harmed, or killed, depending on whatever the player wants to figure as their downfall. The Blight of Frost has to do with dreams, lethargy, deep thought, and sorrow. And what happens here with the Blight of Frost is that people that come in contact with it get lost in their own thoughts, kind of trapped into the realm of thought, and start dissociating and ignoring their body. And the reason why this gets in the way, because it prevents someone from taking action, because they just kind of think through everything, so that the actual things that, if there are any forces moving against them, that the person will be unprotected and unable to do anything to stop some of the issues relevant. This was heavily modeled off of, I'll explain that later. The Blight of Fire is associated with destruction, hatred, rage, violence, and war. What happens with the Blight of Fire is that they become gradually... The Blight of Fire occurs, when someone is exposed to violence, especially if they do it themselves or encounter resistance, they'll become gradually more and more convinced that the righteousness of their cause and the need for violence to solve it, and it leads into a cycle where they kind of lose sense of they almost become so dogmatic that they lose sense of their original goals, and it becomes destructive. These were modeled off of various Shakespearean characters and Gothic ones, based off of several Gothic and Shakespearean characters. Blight of Fire, Blight of Fire is kind of a behavior for... it was actually heavily inspired by Laertes from Hamlet, as well as debatably Macbeth and Claudius. And even if we're going to Gothic things, something like tend to be the more monstrous characters like Dracula, the later stages of the monster, and Victor Frankenstein can be seen as representations of the Blight of Fire. The Blight of Frost was actually heavily inspired by Hamlet's behavior in Hamlet, and can be seen in a lot of the the Gothic characters well, especially ones of Kafka or Lovecraftian ones. The Blight of Rot, you can even see some of statements from Macbeth's Macbeth. Several of his statements have to do with kind of losing the interest in that, as well as this can be seen in a few Lovecraftian ones as well, and just in general any of the Poe related stories that have that descent into madness theme. The Blight of Shadow, I think I include the same image in the book, can be seen in Julius Shakespeare, as and things like Doctor and Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or other things where non-obvious threats become very bad problems, and you can see that affecting and playing on the characters, how the betrayers can become just as paranoid because they know what they would do.
So let's step away from Domains of Shadows for a little bit. One thing that I've noticed about you during this is that you seem to be a huge fan of both Shakespeare and Gothic material in general. How do those pique an interest for you?
What I think, I'll start kind of with the Gothic horror element, is although people think that, Gothic horror is heavily outdated or probably not relevant, what I actually find is that it was written at a time where a lot of the world was changing and coming into what it is now, that 19th century period, and it was heavily dealing with, very criticism of what was, and Gothic was almost very critical of the kind of societal movements or the positions that were going along. And what I like about the Gothic horror is I think it's actually very relevant to today and helps you process through and I think it's kind of almost helped me think through and process several of the major things that are elements of modern day. These are topics like lack lack of faith and reliability of science. The costs of boldness or searching too deep. How the extent to which emotions control behavior. How people in power can become corrupted, and even those who can't. How women fit into society, how our exploration with nature and how we relate to it. The Gothic heavily involves many of these topics, which are very important to us living in the modern world, and presents them in a way that really leads to a growthful mindset and understanding, and better understanding of the world and ourselves.
It's it's like a mirror into how things are going right now. I find that there's been a lot of revitalization into, at least into the interest of Gothic, and specifically Gothic horror, like you said, with how things have been going in the world right now.
In some ways, you could even consider a lot of the Gothic ones were both showing the time and prophesying several things to come, especially conflicts like the loss of faith, what happens when you disconnect to nature, what happens when you try to embrace and understand things that you can't, what happens when you try to ignore or push away emotions, what happens when you trust authority too much. Things like that. I think
Yeah.
those were all what the Gothic story centered around. I think they were both telling what was developing during that time, and almost you could say prophesying or interpreting what is going on right now.
Yeah, it definitely looks that way. History repeating itself and the such. So the other thing I wanted to know, though, in that question was what draws you to Shakespeare and the Shakespearean tragedies that he is so very well known for.
So the main thing that I like about Shakespeare is fundamentally all of his are studies into human behavior. Now they're oftentimes dramatic things, but what they do
Yeah.
is they they take kind of a look at, the basic parts of human behavior and how they interact in all of the different ways. He's written everything from tragedies to histories to comedies. What I like about Shakespeare is that I know some people can find it overcomplicated, but what he does and what I think is important in a lot of storytelling is it brings up many different elements, how they're important and how they're interlinked. It's a world of interlinking parts where both inside and even between plays things affect each other and where themes repeat. It creates this kind of world of a relationship, as well as explorations of several, like the effect of society on behavior, especially in types of like militant, especially militant or academic mentalities. Shakespeare is almost in a way a kind of a combination there between philosophy and psychology. It's an analysis of basically everything related to humanity, but in a way that doesn't distance humanity and actually sees it from the inward perspective. That's all of theater in general, but Shakespeare is one of the most available resources.
Yeah, 100% he is. One of the things that's been coming up a lot recently with tabletop games is sensitivity. And Domain of Shadows feels like there are a lot of things that can be taken and abused in the system if someone's not fair to their group, I should say, or the people who are performing and playing it with them. So I know that you have come up with a number of safety mechanisms that can be gone over in regards to that. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that can be done with Domains of Shadows to make sure that it's an enjoyable experience for everybody as well as
One
an
thing I would like to
audience?
state is that first statement is actually a misconception. A lot of people tend to think that due to the horror or tragedies or tragic elements, while it is sadder, this isn't necessarily in ways that a lot of people will find openly disturbing, because what needs to be said here is that although the Gothic and Shakespearean can get dark, if it gets violent, it usually occurs off screen or is not described in detail or not given a big part of the story. What you'll actually find is this is actually a lot less explicit or harmful than most other games, because in D&D or something like Pathfinder you have a lot of violence, including especially disturbing manners like medieval weaponries, fires, acids, gases, but biological weapons, which seldom ever show up in the system. In fact, actually, from what I've run into, you might have one or two fights that are largely abstracted. So far, almost minimal sexual content, haven't had much to do with drugs. I haven't. I mean, I've seen a few bits here and there of alcohol. None of the groups I've had dealt with themes of abuse, though. You're not any more likely to do it here than in something like D&D. I mean, to be completely
Yeah.
honest, I think that's a common misconception, is that a lot of people see the horror in Shakespearean, but really, you're dealing with a lot heavier themes in D&D, because you're dealing with a very violent and cruel and almost nihilistic world that reduce it down to hit points, which this doesn't do. So I mean, I always just tend to use to I always like to use safety tools, obviously, but I just think that's something that should be used generally
Yeah.
for role playing. I don't If you can handle the type of very messed up things that occurs in most D&D and Pathfinder games, which have been so violent that even I've been turned off from them, then I don't know how you could possibly be disturbed by anything in Domains of Shadow.
That's really good to hear because I know that especially in the independent developer side of things, indie games appeal to a very different audience than D&D. A lot of the times it's people who've been turned off from the big tabletop role-playing games that by their rules as written sort of lack those safety mechanisms as more than just like a check with your group kind of thing. I've heard, I mean, there's entire pages on the internet to describe the horror stories that people have had with their dungeon masters. And I think one of the things that really helps Domains of Shadows here is that it is GMless.
Can you explain that connection between why it would be easier if it's GMless to stay content safe?
Okay, so Yeah, one of the things I've noticed is a lot of the times, a lot of these horror stories happen from either a bad player, but more times that I've seen from these things, it tends to come from a power tripping DM is the best way to explain it. I've had a couple. It's not common. I would say that for the most part, most people know to stay away from certain topics, but in these power heavy worlds, you see it happen more frequently than. I guess I should say that due to D&D's big net and Pathfinder's big net, they attract a much larger audience, and there's just higher chance to run into different people.
I will also, state I kind of brought this up earlier, but
Hmm.
I mean, I've heard people say like, I've heard kind of people say I don't want to deal with dark themes, then go to D&D, and I'm like, what's going on in D&D is a lot of, especially with kind of something with hit points, is D&D is also very centered on violence, which, and especially it's not even it's one thing for like to see someone shot, but in D&D you have things, people being burned alive, like choking on toxic gases,
Hmm.
biological, things that if used in real life would be considered war crimes, which are
Yeah.
standard. No one thinks second about a firebolt in D&D.
No.
And I think it's also kind of D&D's, it kind of reduces the people down to hit points. Like it usually doesn't care if it's just kind of common that, one of the enemies dies. And I think what can happen, for example, in D&D with desensitizing is you're just so used to having these masses like goblins, orcs just dying left and right
Hmm.
that when you finally reach the point where someone can't handle it, it's just hard to imagine that because, you know, like there's a body count of 20 going on in the last session.
Yeah.
It would probably feel. I think that's also just kind of its to take that entertainment or not guilt from a
Hmm.
violent form of entertainment, you have to distance yourself, and I feel
Yeah.
like that's definitely a big fault. Is that sometimes that distancing doesn't always work.
Yeah. It can be tricky. So a big thing about Wheel of the Weird, and the stuff you're putting out is you've directly stated that you want to look at actual plays and role playing as an art form versus just being a game. What are some of the ways you think that people can experience and get that insight?
So let me state that really, the definition of fine arts is pretty soft. What I mean in this case is that what I mostly mean in this case that it's actually worthy of some study and viewing by an outside audience.
Okay.
I know that some people would debate with me. I would consider most sports an art form.
Hmm.
I'm thinking that mainly my comment there is that it's not something that a bunch of people are doing math in the basement for. It should be something that should kind of be looked for how can it explain certain concepts? How can it be used to teach? How can it be used to appeal to an audience? So I think that's the main thing that I'm referring to in an art form. In truth, I don't. That more has to do with changing of logistical details. But I do think that there are some design things that can make it accessible outside of the direct play. That art form thing is basically the opinion that it should be relevant to someone other than the artist, or in this case, the player.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people can resonate with that. We are actually starting to run pretty low on time here, but I got two more questions for you. So obviously a big thing that's been happening this past couple of years has been COVID. How has COVID affected the development of Domains of Shadows, considering it started its development prior to the actual pandemic?
So, to be completely honest, before the pandemic outbreak, I was mostly research and design. I was going to have to do playtesting online anyway because although I do have game stores around me. They're
Hmm.
very D&D centric, and
Yeah.
I couldn't get many playtests for this. So really, it hasn't affected my system's progress much at all. I would have to have gone online anyway. In some
Okay.
ways, it might have helped because more people went online.
Yeah.
But yeah, it didn't really slow me down. It's a digital only product, so no printing errors.
Okay.
Yeah, so it really didn't get in the way, to be honest.
So it didn't really get in the way, but it did give you time, I'm assuming, to kind of work on it more.
Uh, I don't know how much it gave me more time. I still had a
Uh,
job.
you were like me and had to work too. I totally understand that. All right. Well, this has been great. Nathan, where can people find more about you, more about Wheel of the Weird, and Domains of Shadows?
Probably the best ways to contact me is through my email at ncavalier63 at gmail.com, which is currently my base email. Or you can contact me through Discord at this ID. I use Discord for most playtesting and a lot of forum discussion.
Yeah, everything that you're sending me will definitely be posted in the links down below. So,
And if you really want to, you can talk to me through Facebook Messenger, though I conduct very few activities outside of.
yeah.
Though I guess if we are discussing one thing I would like to give a big shout out for where I learned of several systems to inspire me to, where I learned of several systems where I had a lot of discussion is there is a specific Facebook group called I'm begging you to play another TTRPG, another RPG, in reference to 5e, and I have gotten so many useful things for role playing. It's probably one of the best resources if you're looking for role playing outside the world of D&D. It has
Okay.
many great resources and great discussions. Obviously, by the title, they can get a little petty at points, but they're usually a good lot.
I'm glad that you found a community that's there to help you and support building this game. It's shaping up to be something really interesting. The detail you go into in the PDF for the draft alone is exquisite. It's very. I could sit down and run not run, but like bring a group of people and we could play this in like under an hour of looking at it. So I'm very excited to see where Domains of Shadows and the rest of the Wheel of the Weird goes.
I guess kind of one thing I would like to plug at the end is
100%.
not really sure who's listening here. This project is supposed to be looked at by the end of the summer.
Okay.
And I currently am trying to look for an artist to do a cover art for it.
Okay.
So far, that's been a very involved and complicated process. If there are any artists or people who know anyone that would be good with kind of this gothic or tragic art, please come into contact with me and so we can work things. Because by now the design is becoming really to a close. Okay. I need to do some things from graphic design, and I want more playtests in. Mm-hmm. But by this point, we're into the very final stages of producing this. It's just not being sold, so there's no Kickstarter.
Yeah. Okay, well, if you know an artist, please get in contact with Nathan. His links will all be down below. Nathan, thank you so much for coming on here and talking about Domains of Shadows with us.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Nathan and Domains of Shadows is scheduled for launch very soon. Have a good night. Bye. Thank you to Nathan for coming onto the show this week. If you're an artist or you know one looking for some work, please consider sending him a message and seeing if you can work something out. And thank you for listening. There's been a huge jump in listeners lately, and it's been incredibly humbling. If you like the show and you want to hear more, please consider leaving a review or mentioning it to a friend, because word of mouth is the best way to grow. Next week, we have a very cool episode, which will be featuring the new sign language role-playing game, Inspire Isles, and it's Queer Rich. I hope to see you there.